Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Room Schoolhouse. Today we are highlighting Henry Highland Garnet, a hero in the civil rights era, really kind of Civil War era, and such a fun story as we unfold this. As we get into this story, there's a lot of details that we will not be able to cover in their full extent of what the story is. If you want to know more, go to WallBuilders.com. You certainly can follow along with us if you get one of these little printouts, whether you get the PDF or the printed version. And there's footnotes at the back of this on the WallBuilders website. There's links to lots of the story. But Henry Highland Garnet, like many of the heroes we are covering, was born into slavery. Now, he was born in Maryland. His family was rescued when he was 9 years old. There was a group of Quakers that helped rescue his family. And the Quakers are, I feel like, side note, worth talking about for a moment, because so often we hear the narrative of every white person was racist and there wasn't really an anti-slavery movement until like the 1800s. The reality is, like back in the 1600s, the Quakers were starting anti-slavery movement kind of stuff. And the Quakers have kind of always been known for two things historically, being against war and being against slavery. So it's not surprising that when you look, especially in the 1800s and much more the pro-abolition movement, that you find the Quakers helping rescue people out of slavery. Again, we're talking about the era of the Underground Railroad, a lot of stuff happening. So Henry Highland Garnet and his family, they are rescued by a group of Quakers. They get to New York. In New York, he begins an education, working on a farm as well. On the farm, has kind of a significant accident. And by significant, his leg is crushed to some extent. So much so that actually over the course of his life, it never heals. He decided many years later, this thing's just kind of in the way. Let's just cut it off.
Right.
It's a pretty significant decision. It also makes me much more grateful for modern medicine that probably you break a leg significantly, we can still fix that thing. Back then, it's in the way, cut it off. Well, before he cuts it off, he has his leg doesn't really work, but he is pursuing education. He's at a school, and while he's at the school, there were some racists who decided there's a school with black people attending. That school shouldn't be in operation. So they came with guns to literally shut the school down and presumably maybe even kill people who were there if anybody resists, doesn't leave. Henry Highland Garnet, though, this is where, as pro-Second Amendment people, we can appreciate this on a different level. Henry Highland Garnet gets a shotgun and is able to chase these would-be thugs, these bad guys, away with a shotgun. And so often we hear incidents of somebody with a gun terrorizing things, and one of the antidotes we know, what's the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun?
A good guy with a gun.
The only type of gun control all three of us believe in is using two hands.
Unless you had to have a gun in each hand, then you can definitely go one hand for
That
a
also
gun.
works.
And I feel like you were going to interject something there.
Or a woman could be a good woman with a gun.
And in fairness, there are some women I've seen much better with guns than men. Be well trained. But the reality was, Henry Highland Garnet got a shotgun, defends the school, which is maybe, let's go back to the point. I love that there are now schools that are saying, hey, we want some teachers to be trained, to be armed, to protect and defend the school. But you're talking about a student. Somebody attending the school who had a gun, and we definitely can go back to the 1800s. There's more than one account of students bringing firearms to school, because maybe if they live, especially if you live in the country, if you were living maybe out in some of the Western Plains, in some of the Western states, where it could be dangerous and you might have to go miles to school, it was not unusual at times for students to have a sidearm, to have a rifle or shotgun going to school. And again, there's more than one account historically of students actually defending the school from thieves or bad guys, Indian attacks, whatever the case might be. It's kind of different to think about students maybe having guns at school.
Absolutely. And Tim, I think something important to highlight is the fact that why did they feel the need to attack that school? Was it just by virtue of black people going there to receive an education? Or did the attackers understand that if someone obtained an education, it would ultimately unfit them to be a slave? That's something that Frederick Douglass understood, that through literacy, you would obtain knowledge, and through knowledge, liberty.
So these bad guys want to stop the school. Henry Highland Garnet with a shotgun says, not going to happen. Well, as his education goes on, he ends up going to school, seminary, becomes a minister, becomes an ordained minister. And this is also abolition era. So he's actually the leader of several different abolition movements, part of several different groups, promoting for freedom, helping with the Underground Railroad. And as we're leading into the time where the Civil War unfolds, he's encouraging Abraham Lincoln, one of many black civil rights leaders, telling Abraham Lincoln, you ought to open up and allow some of these black patriots to come and fight for freedom, to fight to preserve the Union, to fight against slavery. In the midst of this, he also decides that as a minister, he wants to help and becomes a chaplain during the Civil War, which of course, I love the connection that you can be a person of faith. And we can go back historically, founding fathers, some of the great people of the American Revolution were pastors who led their congregation to battle. This is like what Henry Highland Garnet on some level is doing. He is out with men in the field as a chaplain, giving spiritual direction in the midst of this major moral conflict known as the Civil War.
Right, and he does a good job of highlighting black patriots throughout history. He even features Robert Smalls, who we talked about in another video, in one of his sermons and brings him to speak in his church in New York City.
Yeah, and let's go back to that for a second, because this is really worth noting. When Robert Smalls was able to capture the pilot, the planter, he was the pilot on the planter. When he gets the planter and they get it, they turn it into the Union forces, he's honored and rewarded. Well, at this time, Henry Highland Garnet is pastor of a church in Washington, D.C. So when Robert Smalls goes to meet with Abraham Lincoln, he's invited to go to Henry Highland Garnet's church. And there's a several minute ovation for Robert Smalls as people are applauding the courage of what he did. Well, this is the pastor of the church that celebrated Robert Smalls to make that full circle connection.
Right. And also he worked to enlist black people into the fight. So we think about it now, pastors enlisting soldiers to fight. That sounds a little extreme. It happened all the time.
Absolutely.
Yes. So after he becomes a chaplain, he actually moves to Washington, D.C., and he takes the pastorate position over the very prestigious 15th Street Presbyterian Church. And he has a very strong congregation there. He has direct access to the Lincoln administration and the Republican anti-slavery members of the Congress. So in 1864, when Lincoln is running for re-election, he runs on the Republican platform to abolish slavery, and that's how we get into the 13th Amendment. Then Congress introduced the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, and I just want to go over the statistics here because I find them fascinating. So in 1865, the U.S. House voted on the amendment. So of the 114 Republicans, 100% voted to end slavery.
That means all of them, right?
100%.
100
Yep,
per
all of them.
Okay. So Republicans all on board. I'm sure like the Democrats, though, they probably supported, right?
Well, we'll get into that. There was 34 third party.
Okay.
And 73% of them voted to end slavery.
So the majority of independents were like, good idea, we should end slavery in America.
Correct.
Yeah, it's the Democrats, right? I mean, this is a prestigious party. Surely they're like, guys, we agree, slavery's wrong, we should end this.
Well, there were 84 Democrats, and a full 79% of them voted to continue slavery.
Oh, so Democrats weren't really against slavery.
21% of them were, unfortunately.
and this is where, historically, we can acknowledge that the reason there were so few Democrats in Congress is because when the South seceded, so many of the southern states said, hey, there's no reason to leave our people in Congress there because we're forming our own nation. But there were several states that were pro-slavery, like in Maryland, that did not secede. And so they still had their congressmen, their representatives there. And so that's where you see some of this disparity. There were far more Democrats who were pro-slavery than just what this number represents from the vote. But it does kind of give indication when the South seceded and all their members are gone, now Republicans do have control and power. And really, this could be like almost this providential moment. Had the South not seceded and removed their congressmen, Republicans wouldn't have had the numbers probably to get this done. But also worth noting, when the 13th Amendment is passed, Republicans say we should do something special to celebrate and honor what we've just done.
And today, what they did would have been seen as very uncommon, but then it was very regular. They decided to hold a sermon of thanks for the abolition of slavery. And who did they invite to speak on the U.S. House floor? None other than Henry Highland Garnet. He would actually end up becoming the first Black American to address all of Congress. And during that speech, he went forward and talked about his experiences, his personal experiences of going through the dredges of slavery, but also, in a very peculiar manner, thanking the founding fathers, specifically George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, for planting the seeds of abolition in our country.
Now, you're saying in a very peculiar manner, he was thanking Washington and Jefferson. It's only peculiar in the modern narrative.
That is exactly correct, because even if you look back then with the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens, vice president of the CSA, he specifically also stated that the founding fathers were ultimately against abolition. So back then, it was commonly known by Black Americans and even the Confederates that our founding fathers created a nation that would eventually end the heinous sin of slavery.
And to your point, when you look at some of the Confederate leaders who were talking about the founding fathers being anti-slavery, some of those Confederate leaders actually condemned the founding fathers for being anti-slavery. Yes. So when you look at a Henry Highland Garnet, when you look at a Frederick Douglass, when you look at some of the major civil rights leaders, they recognized that the founding fathers really were anti-slavery, which is just not the narrative we hear today.
So just to interject really fast, I just want to point out that we do at WallBuilders have a bunch of information on this. And so this book right here, it's called American History in Black and White, and this is about the Reconstruction era. And there's also a DVD form of it. So it has all of this in greater detail. And of course, it has tons of footnotes in it.
A ton of footnotes. So all of this, the reason we even want to highlight even the footnotes is because this is well-documented stuff. It's just not a story being told today. And Henry Highland Garnet is a civil rights leader who his courage, his spiritual leadership was significant. And he's somebody that should be honored and celebrated. If you want to know more, go to wallbuilders.com. You can find out way more about so many of these Black heroes, and Henry Highland Garnet, certainly someone to know more about. For more information, just join us next time on One Room Schoolhouse.